Memoirs of the Reverend George Whitefield, Chapter 15. From his first visit to Ireland to his opening a new tabernacle at London in the year 1753. After a passage of 5 days, he arrived at Dublin, May 24th, 1751. There he was received gladly and lodged at the house of Mr. L., preaching also every morning and evening. Surely, says he, here are many converted souls. Among them are 2 or 3 students and several soldiers. At first the greatness and hurry of the place surprised me, but thanks be to the Lord of the harvest. Here, as well as elsewhere, the fields are white, ready for harvest. Congregations are large, and here as for eternity. And again, Athlone, Athlone, June 10th. For this week past, I have been preaching twice, almost every day, in some country towns. I found that the many offenses that have lately been given, matters were brought to a low ebb. But the cry now is, Methodism is revived again. Footnote. In the MS, he says, I took a journey from near Havenford west to Ireland, where a yet greater work had been begun and carried on to a high degree amidst prodigious opposition. Numbers converted not only from popery but to Jesus Christ at Athlone, Dublin, Limerick, Cork, and various other places. End of the footnote. At Limerick and Cork he preached to great multitudes undisturbed, although the Methodists had met with violent persecution there. At Bandon and Kinsale the like blessings attended him, and at Cork the numbers of affectionate hearers greatly increased. Being detained at Belfast by the urgent importunity of the people, he preached in many towns and villages, and so great was the prospect of success that he wished he had visited the north of Ireland sooner. But he hastened to Scotland, intending to return before winter to his beloved charge in America. In July 1751 he therefore went from Belfast to Irving, where the magistrates requested him to preach, and from thence to Glasgow. July 12th he writes thus, Though I preached nearly 80 times in Ireland, and God was pleased to bless his word, yet Scotland seems to be a new world to me. To see the people bring so many Bibles, turn to every passage where I am expounding and hanging, as it were, upon me, to hear every word is very encouraging. I feel an uncommon freedom here, and talking with the winter as well as the summer saints feeds and delights my heart. Footnote. Here it may be proper once for all to take notice of some peculiarities relating to Mr. Whitefield's visits to Scotland, which he continued till within a few years of his death, though after the years of 1741 and 1742 there were no such extensive new awakenings. Mr. Whitefield's coming was always refreshing to serious persons and seemed to put new life into them, and also to be the means of increasing their numbers. His preaching was still eminently useful in various respects. In the first place, it had an excellent tendency to destroy the hurtful spirits of bigotry and excessive zeal for smaller matters, and to turn men's attentions to the great and substantial things of religion. Another effect was that it drew several persons to hear the gospel, who seldom went to hear it from other ministers. Again, young people in general were very much benefited by his ministry, and peculiarly young students, who became afterwards serious evangelical preachers. Lastly, his morning discourses, which were mostly intended for sincere but disconsolate souls, were peculiarly fitted to the direct and encourage all such in the Christian life. In his addresses in the evening to the promiscuous multitudes who then attended him were of a very alarming kind. There was something exceedingly striking in the solemnity of his evening congregation in the Orphan House Park at Edinburgh and a high churchyard of Glasgow, especially towards the conclusion of his sermons, which were commonly very long, though they seemed short to the hearers, when the whole multitude stood fixed and like one man hung upon his lips with silent attention, and many under deep impressions of the great objects of religion and the concerns of eternity. These things will not soon be forgotten, and it is hoped that many good effects which, by the divine blessing, attended them, never will. His conversation was no less reviving than his sermons. Many in Edinburgh and Glasgow are witnesses of this, especially at Glasgow, when in company with his good friends Mr. McLaurin and Mr. Robert Scott, one might challenge the sons of pleasure with all their wit, good humor, and gaiety, and furnish entertainment so agreeable. At the same time, no part of it was most agreeable than it was useful and edifying. His friends in Scotland, among whom were many of all ranks from the highest to the lowest, were very constant in study in their great regard for him, and his opposers grew more and more mild. Some anonymous pamphlets were written against him at his first coming, but these soon died and were forgotten. Afterwards a number of stories were handed about to his disadvantage, but upon inquiry it was found either that matters were misrepresented or exaggerated, or that there was no foundation for such reports at all. In short, when they were traced to their origin, they rather turned out to his honor. He used to smile at good Mr. McLaurin, honest zeal, who on such occasions spared no pains to come at the truth, and when he had discovered it, was no less eager to communicate the discovery to others, for the vindication of Mr. Whitefield's character, in which he thought the credit of religion was concerned. The following incident is well remembered. One, Lieutenant Wright alleged that Mr. Whitefield had kept back money sent by a gentleman to her son in America. This coming to Mr. McLaurin's ears, he was restless till he procured a meeting between Whitefield and his accuser. They met. Mr. Wright did not retract what he had said, upon which a letter was instantly written to the mother at London, and her answer being received, a confutation of the calamity was published in Glasgow Current in the following terms. October 31st, 1748. A story having been spread in this town of Mr. Whitefield's having received £20 from a gentlewoman in London to give to her son in Georgia, whereas he had received only 3 guineas, which he had returned to the gentlewoman when he came back from Georgia, her son having been gone from thence before his arrival. A letter was written to London to clear up this affair, to which the gentlewoman has sent her answer. Sir, this is to assure you that I received of Mr. John Stevens the 3 guineas, which was the full sum that I gave you for your son. I hope it is only a false aspiration on him, for I never heard that he would say any such thing, being 3 months in England. I am, etc., September 13th, 1748. There is likewise a receipt handed down dated September 3rd to Mr. Stevens. Both the letter and the receipt are to be seen in the hands of the publisher. But indeed, Mr. Whitefield's whole behavior was so open to the eyes of the world in his character, after which stood many attacks from all quarters, came at last to be so thoroughly established that several of his opposers in Scotland seemed rather to acquire a certain degree of esteem for him. At least, they all thought proper to give over speaking against him. When he was at Glasgow, he always lodged with Mr. James Nevin, merchant, above the cross, till, towards the end of his life, his asthmatic disorder made the town air disagreeable with him. And then he went out in the evenings and stayed with his good friend, Mr. McLaurin. It's M''Culloch, at Cambus Lane. A person of eminence, whom a sincere esteem of Mr. Whitefield made attentive to his reception and administration in Scotland, from first to last, writes thus to the compiler. Edinburgh, January 1772. I think more might be said, with great justice, concerning the effects of his ministry in Scotland. After the first 2 years, as there was always a remarkable revival following each of his visits, which many of the ministers testified to from their peculiar knowledge, and especially by the number of new communicants. Mention might be made of the great number of ministers in Scotland that employed him, and of the many affectionate letters he received from them, of which there were a good many printed in both in London and Glasgow weekly histories. From some of the most eminent men in the church who had employed him to preach in their pulpit, and continued to do when the opportunity offered, except in the Presbyterian of Edinburgh, and even there the magistrates always allowed him a church to preach in every time he came. End of the footnote. He was much pleased at this time to hear that Mr. Dinwiddie, brother-in-law to the Reverend Mr. McLaughlin, it's M''C''L''C''H, of Cambuslang, was appointed governor of Virginia. There had been a remarkable awakening in that province for several years, in particular in Hanover County, and parts adjacent, being unsupported by the established clergy, and having put themselves under the care of the Synod of New York, the Methodists were greatly discouraged by men in power. However, Providence interposed in their behalf, for the Reverend Samuel Davis, afterwards president of the college at New Jersey, was licensed and placed over a congregation, after which the power of religion increased, and one congregation in a short time was increased to 7. Thus had these good people the pleasing prospect of enjoying equal privileges with Protestant dissenters at home. August 6th, he set out from Edinburgh for London, in order to embark for America. He had thrown up much blood in Edinburgh, but traveling recovered him. He was much refreshed with hearing of the happy effects of his labors at Kendal the year before. Having taken an affectionate farewell of his friends at home, he set sail at the Antelope, Captain M''Len, bound for Georgia, with Germans taking several children with him. October 27th, he arrived at Savannah and had the consolation to find the orphan house in a flourishing state. Thanks be to God, says he, all is well at Bethesda. A most excellent tract of land is granted to me, very near the house, which in a few years I hope will make a sufficient provision for it. November 1751. In the beginning of April 1752, he was partly at Bethesda and partly in South Carolina, always alert in the path of duty. I intended, says he, by God's assistance now to begin, for as yet, alas, I have done nothing. Oh, that I may be in earnest. It is a new year. God quickened my tardy pace, and helped me to do much work in a little time. This is my highest ambition. Having suffered from the climate formerly, he did not choose to spend the summer in America, but again embarked in April for London. He arrived in a very seasonable time, as it was the intention of government to put the infant colony on the same footing with the others, whereby it was hoped it would soon become a flourishing province. This revived his spirits much. He now thought that the providence was appearing for Georgia and Bethesda, and determined, therefore, to dispose of his plantation and to carry all his strength to the orphan house. In June, he planned a new excursion. Next week, says he, God willing, I will go to Portsmouth, and through Bath to Wales, and maybe to Scotland and Ireland. And we find his letters about this time dated at Portsmouth, Bristol, Cardiff, and Haverfordwest. In returning to Bristol, he made an association at which were present about 9 clergymen and nearly 40 lay preachers who, says he, I trust are all born of God, and desires to promote his glory and his people's good. All was harmony and love. August the 17th. His letter of this date from London to his friend Dr. T., the celebrated electrical philosopher, deserves a particular notice here. I find you grow more and more famous in the learned world, as you have made a pretty considerable progress in the mysteries of electricity. I would now humbly recommend to your diligent and unprejudiced pursuit and study the mystery of the new birth. It is a most important, interesting study, and when mastered will richly answer and repay you for all your pains. One at whose bar we are shortly to appear hath solemnly declared that without it we cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. You will excuse this freedom. I must have a liquid Christia in all my letters. From London he next proceeded to Edinburgh, where he arrived at the beginning of September 1752. He preached twice in his way at Lutherworth, the parish of the famous John Wycliffe, and at Leicester, and at each place much good was done. At Newcastle he was entreated to stay and preached 4 times to a very large congregation. At Edinburgh and Glasgow he labored as usual. From the latter he writes, "At Edinburgh great multitudes, among whom were an abundancy of the better sort, attended twice a day. Many young ministers and students have given close attention, and I hear of several persons that have been brought under deep conviction. I intended to send you a copy of 2 letters from a Highland schoolmaster who is honored of God to do much good among the poor Highland children. I have brave news from Lancaster and Newcastle, and have strong invitations to Yorkshire and Lancashire. From a pity it is what the year goes round so soon." Good note. In 1752, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, upon a division of the House by a few votes, disposed Mr. Gillespie, which afterwards gave occasion to the society called the Presbytery of Relief. Whitefield, being informed of the circumstances of that affair, writes thus: "I wish Mr. Gillespie joy. The Pope, I find, has turned Presbyterian. The Lord reigns. That is enough for us." And again, "Now will Mr. Gillespie do more good in a week than before in a year. How blind is Satan! What does he get by casting out Christian servants? I expect that some great good will come out of this confusion." End of the footnote. On his return to London he preached at Berwick and all the principal towns. November 1st, from Sheffield he writes, "Since I left Newcastle I have scarce known sometimes, whether I was in heaven or on earth. At Leeds, Barstow, Haworth, Halifax, thousands and thousands have flocked twice a day to hear the word of God. I am now come from Bolton, Manchester, Stockport, and Chinley. Yesterday I preached in a church. 4 ordained ministers, friends of the work of God, have been with me. The word has run so swiftly at Leeds that friends are come to fetch me back. I am now going to Rotherham, Whitefield, Leeds, York, and Epworth. God favors us with weather, and I would fain make hay while the sun shines. Oh, that I had as many tongues as there are hairs upon my head. The ever-loving, ever-lovely Jesus should have them all. Fain would I die preaching." November 10th, he arrived at the Tabernacle in London. December 15th, he writes, "My hands are full of work, and I trust I can say, the Lord causes his work to prosper in my unworthy hands. More blessed seasons were never enjoyed. Our sacramental occasions have been exceedingly awful and refreshing." He now thought of erecting a new tabernacle, a conspicuous building, 80 feet square, which was finished December following. Mr. Hervey and he, about this time, were employed in revising each other's works. Of Mr. Hervey's, he says, "For me to play the critic on them would be like holding up a candle in the sun. However, I will just make a few places marked down as you desire. I foretell their fate. Nothing but your scenery can screen you. Self will never bear to die, though slain in so genteel a manner, without showing some resentment against its artful murderer. Again, I thank you 1,000 times for the trouble you have been at revising my poor compositions, which I am afraid you have not treated with a becoming severity. How many pardons shall I ask for mangling, and I fear murdering your Theron and spelled Aspasio. If you think my 2 sermons will do for the public, please pray return them immediately. I have nothing to comfort me but this, that the Lord chooses the weak things of this world to confound the strong, and things that are not to bring to naught things that are. I write for the poor, you for the polite and noble. God will assuredly own and bless what you write." About this time he was very much afflicted on the account of the death of the Reverend Mr. Stewart, a valuable minister who began to be popular in the church, but was soon called to his everlasting rest. When I meet the workmen to contract about the building, I could scarce bear to think of building a tabernacle. Strange that so many should be so soon discharged. And we continue. Mr. Stewart spoke of his Lord as long as he could speak at all. He had no clouds nor darkness. I was with him till a few minutes before he slept in Jesus. March 1st, 1753. He laid the foundation of the new tabernacle and preached from Exodus 20:24. While the building was erecting, he preached abroad in Moorfields and Spitalfields and made excursions to Chatham, Sheerness, and Braintree. In April, he went for a few days to Norwich. Footnote: a young man of the city of Norwich, of about 18 years of age, was walking one morning with a party of other young men who had all agreed to make that day a holiday. The first object that attracted their attention was an old woman who pretended to tell fortunes. They immediately employed her to tell theirs, and that they might fully qualify her for their undertaking, first made her thoroughly intoxicated with spirituous liquor. The young man of whom mention was first made was informed, among other things, that he would live to a very old age and see his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren growing up around him. Though he had assisted in qualifying the old woman for the fraud by intoxicating her, yet he had credulous enough to be struck with these parts of her predictions which relate to him. And so, quoth he, when alone, I am to see children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. At that age I must be a burden to the young people. What shall I do? There is no way for an old man to render himself more agreeable to youth than by setting and telling them pleasant and profitable stories. I will then, thought he, during my youth, endeavor to store my mind with all kinds of knowledge. I will see and hear and note down everything that is rare and wonderful, that I may sit with incapable of other employment and entertain my descendants. Thus shall my company be rendered pleasant, and I shall be respected rather than neglected in old age. Let me see what I can acquire first. Oh, here is the famous Methodist preacher Whitefield. He is to preach, they say, tonight. I will go and hear him. From these strange motives, the young man declared he went to hear Whitefield. He preached that evening from Matthew 3, verse 7. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, he said unto them, O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Mr. Whitefield, said the young man, described the Sadducean character. This did not touch me. I thought myself as good a Christian as any man in England. From this he went to that of the Pharisees. He described their exterior decency, but observed that the poison of the viper rattled in their hearts. This rather shook me. At length in the course of his sermon he abruptly broke off, paused for a few moments, then burst into a flood of tears, lifted up his hands and eyes, and exclaimed, O my hearers, the wrath to come, the wrath to come. These words sunk into my heart like lead in the waters. I wept, and when the sermon was ended, retired alone. For days and weeks I could think of little else. Those awful words would follow me wherever I went. The wrath to come, the wrath to come. The issue was that the young man soon after made a public profession of religion, and in a little time became a considerable preacher. He himself related the foregoing circumstances a few years since to the Reverend Andrew Fuller of Kettering, Kettering. End of the footnote. Preached twice a day. The people flocked with greatest earnestness to hear him. In the evening, some riotous persons endeavored to disturb him, but in vain. It was about this time that he published his expostulatory letter to Count Zinzendorf, the Bishop of the Moravians in London. In May, he took another circuit westward, and everywhere a gracious melting season appeared to be among the people. In about a fortnight, he rode 350 miles and preached about 20 times. And his new tabernacle was opened on Sunday, June 10, 1753, with a sermon in the morning from 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 9. End of chapter 15, having been read by Peter John Priest, is also known as Brian Dean. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God.